address the elephant in the room. Any passage from the Hebrew Scriptures ought to come with its own disclaimer. Please read from the Babylonian exile and backward. This week's text comes with a whole bunch of baggage that can make a progressive modern reader justifiably uncomfortable. In chapter 18, we read about the triumph of Yahweh over the priests of Baal, a triumph that is bloody, gory, and brutal. We can only hope that the total slaughter of the priests of Baal was execution style and not more gruesome than that. As if that wasn't enough to unsettle the heart and mind, our passage today ends with a charge for 2 new kings and a new prophet in training to kill any worshiper of Baal. This, of course, is cast in the midst of a biblical narrative that is soaked in blood from beginning to end. These are hard and violent scriptures, and folly is sure to follow if something isn't said about the historical context in which the books of the kings were created. As I have learned recently, there is a great difference between the setting of a text and the context of a text. The setting, in this case, is the time in which Elijah would have lived, a time of chaos, political intrigue, regicide, and war. The context, however, is what is most important to understand these difficult and often wounding passages. In the case of a vast majority of the Hebrew Scriptures, the context is the Babylonian exile. The widely held theory in religious academic circles is that the Hebrew Scriptures were brought together and edited by 4 distinct groups of writers or scribes. They are J, the Yahwist source, E, the Elohist source, D, the Deuteronomic source, and P, the priestly source. Each source originated in a distinctly different period of time. Each source has its own preferred language, its own specific themes, its own unique perspectives. The source attributed to 1 Kings is D, the Deuteronomic source. The editors and writers of this source are believed to have lived from around the time of King Josiah in the 8th century to sometime during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. D is an extensive source and edited large parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, Deuteronomy, for which the source takes its name, and considerable portions of, for the purpose of today's sermon, 1st and 2nd Kings. These writers were particularly interested in the rise and fall of the kings after the death of Solomon, and their attitude towards every king except Josiah and his grandfather Hezekiah are staunchly negative. The Deuteronomic writers had a pessimistic view because they treasured religious reform in the northern kingdom of Judah and the southern kingdom of Israel. Any brief perusal of Deuteronomy will reveal that its writers and editors were deeply concerned with the purity of the laws and the keeping of the covenant, the penultimate commandment being contained within the Shema of Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 8. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. The Shema continues with admonishments to keep this commandment, this veneration and recognition of Yahweh as the one true God, as signs on one's hand and emblems on one's forehead. The ultimate crime against God was not murder or theft or sexual proclivities. It was idolatry. Israel, both as one whole nation and 2 split nations between the north and the south, had a serious idolatry problem, most especially in the minds of the Deuteronomists. With the rise of kings came the rise of wealth, international relations, and the time-honored tradition of political marriages. In the case of Elijah's time, political marriage meant Jezebel, the great Maleficent of the Hebrew Scriptures, a staunch Baal worshiper. The theme of strong, even violent opposition to idolatry in the D source is the product of 2 distinct contexts: the final evolution of Judaism as a monotheistic religion and the struggle of Israelite faith in the depths of Babylon. It is important always to remember that the passages we read in the Hebrew Scriptures reflect a time and place that is different from the time and place of the men and or women who put these scriptures together. The Deuteronomic source and the priestly source were influenced strongly by the Babylonian Empire. In the case of the D source, the scriptures attributed to them were finalized and edited during the Babylonian exile. The same can be said of the priestly source, which is also credited with the final edit of the entire Old Testament. That means that these scriptures reflect the wounds of a subjugated nation, exiled and under continual social siege by a strong, powerful, and deeply influential foreign power. These scriptures are tainted with blood because the Israelite psyche was bloodied, torn, and wounded. Theirs was a harsh and unforgiving world. Their understanding of God reflected directly the reality of their own experiences. There is a profound touch of psychology within the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures. It is a psychology shaped by a world for which we modern men and women have no comparison. God was wild in those days because the world was wild. I hope no one minds me taking time to address this concern of violence in our text. I fully believe that if we accept, as best as we are able, the wounds within these scriptures, stories arise from them that are beautiful, profound, and just as comforting as the words of Jesus within the Gospels. If we can acknowledge and move forward from the violence that surrounds this story of Elijah, we can then appreciate the poignancy of these scriptures. The point of this Old Testament legend is eternally applicable. God still speaks, ever so softly, from this ancient narrative. Here is the story of a man, a great prophet, a hero of his time, who encountered despair, discouragement, and depression. This is the story of a man who tried to break up with God. This is the story of a believer who found out that God wouldn't break up with him. There's a lot packed in these 9 verses, so it would be best to start from the beginning. The first thing of interest is the fact that, after standing up in front of the entire nation of Judah, northern Israel, and destroying the credibility of the Baal priests, Elijah is now terrified of the second-hand oath of Jezebel. The threat that she delivers, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow," isn't even important enough for her to deliver in person. Elijah isn't captured and brought to her for final judgment. The threat is delivered verbally through a servant. So it's curious that Elijah chooses that moment to run for the hills, literally. It is suggested that Elijah wasn't solely disquieted by Jezebel's threat. It is normal, really, to slide into a bit of an emotional slump after a major accomplishment or victory. Elijah had just defied the strongest woman in the Israelite world, and he had just humiliated hundreds of powerful men and then commanded their abject destruction. He was a hero, a figure who had ascended to the ranks of legend and folklore. Naturally, the low crept in after the high, and Jezebel's words struck Elijah at a vulnerable moment, a moment that would have been vulnerable for any one human. Elijah was also disappointed. Even after such a climatic event, after such a public display of Yahweh's power in front of Baal's worshippers, a reformation did not sweep through Israel from north to south. In fact, God's power didn't seem to do much at all to move the hearts of his idolatrous people. Elijah was feeling let down, emotionally and spiritually. His victory had slipped into the dull reality of everyday life, of everyday human nature. The exhilaration had worn off by the time Jezebel's threat reached him, and in a moment of very human weakness, he ran. It is interesting to note that Elijah didn't just run for the sake of finding somewhere to go and to hide out. Elijah wasn't just depressed, he was suicidal. He purposely went into the wilderness, into the desert, without food and water. He lay down beneath a broom tree, which would have had no real shade to shelter him from the heat, the sun, and the elements. He crawled away from the world. He stretched himself out on a desolate earth that reflected his state of mind. His last intended prayer to God was to let him die. Elijah was ready to give up, to break up, to call it quits on this thing called life. Never mind his own ministry and his relationship with God. He stopped taking care of himself. So God took care of him. He fell asleep, a metaphor for death if ever there was one. But God didn't have the decency to let him wallow in his own melodramatic emotional morass. No, God sent him an angel. This is one of two places in this passage where the translations get conflicted. Many Bibles will translate angel as that, an angel, and readers are left with visions of wings and holy fire. Other translations lobby for the use of the word messenger, which suggests a more mundane, more earthly intercession. In both cases, this is a manifestation of God's presence, of his interest, and his concern. It is interesting to note that God did not initiate a conversation with Elijah right away. He didn't try to talk Elijah out of his stupor. He didn't make Elijah get up and get moving. God met Elijah precisely where he was and attended to the needs of Elijah's body. The prophet was given food and drink. He was allowed to sleep. He was lovingly watched over while he stumbled through his darkness. Before addressing Elijah's spiritual or emotional needs, God addressed his physical needs. There's a lesson here for us who think that our spiritual wells are not tied directly to our bodies first and to our minds after that. After sleeping and eating twice, Elijah got up and wandered. This description of him wandering in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights is directly reminiscent of what happened to the Israelites after their escape from Egypt. This is, perhaps, one of the first hints that Deuteronomic writers considered Elijah a new Moses. Mosaic themes weave their way through this narrative. 40 days and 40 nights are also not only a parallel to Exodus, but a measure of time. Not a specific measure of time, mind you. Time was not at all specific for the characters and writers of the Hebrew Scriptures. 40 days and 40 nights is simply ancient code for a really long time. Once again, Elijah is watched over by God. The passage tells us that Elijah didn't eat in his wandering. He walked through both a literal and metaphorical desert, but the bread and water that God had provided him sustained him through this period of doubt, pain, and confusion. A modern Christian reader, perhaps, could draw a personal parallel to the power of the bread and drink that sit at the heart of our own covenant with Yahweh. Finally, Elijah reaches his destination, another echo of Moses, as Mount Horeb is but another name for Mount Sinai. Here, God had revealed the commandments, the foundation of his great covenant with Israel. Here, God had revealed his glory to Moses as he passed the patriarch's hiding place in the cleft of the rock. In fact, Elijah's cave may be a direct reference to the spot where Moses hid. For sure, Mount Sinai had great significance as a symbol of God's divine revelation and of spiritual renewal. After sleeping, God waits on Elijah's needs yet again. The two finally talk. God asks the obvious, "Why are you here?" One can make theological inferences about divine omnipotence here, but I prefer to think that God was speaking much as my human counselor would, in direct question, cutting to the heart of the matter in order to weigh the response and discern what isn't being said. Elijah responds in what is quite possibly the most pathetic response to divine interest ever. "I've been awesome on your behalf, but now I'm all alone. I'm the only one left to carry your work, and everyone wants to kill me." I generously paraphrase, but that's the basic gist of Elijah's answer. His discouragement leaks through. His narrow focus on the events around him shows. His uncertainty about his faith shapes the choices of his words. God simply tells Elijah to step outside of the cave, for, like with Moses before him, Elijah is about to witness the presence of the Almighty. This is one of the more famous parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, but there are nuances here as well, subtle details to the tale that changes how one might read this narrative. First of all, Elijah disobeys God. He doesn't move from his cave. Wind, earth, and fire move and wail around him outside of the safety of his chosen sanctuary, but Elijah doesn't budge. The text tells us that it wouldn't have mattered anyway. God was not present in any of those things. This may seem curious and rather out of place, since Yahweh reveals himself in older stories in wind, fire, and earthquake. This is where the context of the editors, the Deuteronomists, shows through. Elemental theophany, the revelation of divine presence in natural phenomena, is a strong characteristic of pagan deities. Baal, for example, was present in fire. Nature was a conduit of the divine, the only way for the sacred and the profane to touch. Remember, though, that the Deuteronomists despised idolatry and their disapproval of pagan religions wove the basic fabric of their chosen narratives. So in this story, compiled and edited by the D source, God is not present in the elements, in natural phenomena or disaster. God wasn't present, and Elijah didn't emerge from his fortress of stone until silence had engulfed them both. Here translations get tricky again. Some translations say a gentle little breeze, or the sound of a light whisper, or a still small voice. The translation that I looked up in my academic sources all suggest a sound of sheer silence. This suggests that God did not speak at first. Elijah was left to discern God's presence in the still, in the quiet, in the unknowable. The text doesn't tell us if it was high noon or the dead of midnight, but I have always imagined this meeting of God and man to have taken place at night, in darkness, in the dangerous, and the uncertain. When God finally spoke, he asked again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Here Elijah's stubborn humanness persists in the face of divine revelation. The power of God was manifest in perfect silence, and only then, in a voice that spoke to him as two humans would speak to each other. Elijah's depression persisted, even in the face of the obvious. God had revealed himself, but even miracles and wonders could not restore Elijah's faith. So, God gave Elijah a new commission. God did not try to reason with Elijah. He didn't ask him any other questions. He didn't directly refute Elijah's claims in a one-sided dialogue. No. God simply accepted that Elijah was where he was, emotionally and spiritually. But God wasn't breaking up with Elijah. Depression, suicide, uncertainty, doubt, rejection of a prophetic ministry, and a crisis of faith wasn't enough to break God's relationship with Elijah. God's solution to Elijah's problem was to simply point him in another direction. There is a sense of acceptance on both sides in this narrative. Elijah is not emotionally equipped to go further along in the fight by himself. He had changed. His raw power and passion mellowed to wisdom, caution, and contemplation. So God gave him a companion, Elisha. God has a habit of giving us companions, of sharing our ministries, our struggles, our triumphs, and our woes with others. God has a holy tradition of giving the generations who come before the task of training, supporting, and guiding the generation that comes behind. God is a God of relationship, first and foremost and always. And when his tasks become too overwhelming for one person to handle, he provides. God also reminds Elijah that he is not alone. Once again, the count of 7,000 in Israel is a generic measure. There were not literally 7,000 faithful Israelites. Rather, there was a large and significant number of supporters upon which Elijah could rely. He didn't have to fight against idolatry and royal atrocities by himself. God reminded Elijah that he was part of a community, and that the way to keep from burning himself out was to forge relationships that would see him through his mortal time. The very last lesson that I would glean is that God isn't overly concerned with whether or not we wholly succeed in the tasks that he lays upon us. God gave Elijah 3 tasks: anoint Jehu as king, anoint Hazael as king, and anoint Elisha as a prophet. Elijah only actually ever accomplished one of these tasks, and only sort of kind of. He passed his mantle on to Elisha, but the D source never tells us if he actually anointed Elisha. Elijah never anoints Jehu or Hazael, but that fact is never held against him. Elijah leaves the world as a holy man, one of only 2 men in the Hebrew scriptures to be taken from the earth physically and not through death. Elijah failed him quite a lot, if one thinks about it, but it did not change God's opinion of him. It did not change the depth or the truth of the relationship that he had with God. This story challenges us to answer, where does God meet us? Where is God present? I think that this story also answers the question for us. We find God in darkness, in weird and wild places. We find him in depression, in fear, in crisis, yes, even in violence. Of my own emotions, in the darkness of my experience, in the abject loneliness of my life. When I was about 10 or so, my parents went through a phase where they thought it was okay to lock me in the basement of our 100-year-old house. The top of the basement stairs had backs to them, but the rest of the old wooden stairs had open gaps between each step. Knowing full well that I was terrified of spiders, and not knowing so well that I was terrified of the dark still at that age, I was made to go sit on those open back stairs, alone for hours, and hungry and frightened. I found God there. Don't misunderstand what I am saying here. God was not there in the sense that this was done to me of his doing or design. I did not find God in the darkness and the terror as a 10-year-old. But I am now older, and now when I think back, I can see that he was indeed there. He was with me in my imagination, which whittled away those hours in a way that wasn't quite so terrible. He was with me in my indomitable spirit, which has never, ever been fully broken. He was with me in hope and determination to move forward one awful day at a time, onward to a horizon that I would make better. He did not intercede on my behalf. He did not miraculously save me from my circumstances, but he gave me bread and water to see me through the desert. And as I got older, in the still moments stolen from the chaos of my life, I started to hear him, ever so quiet, ever so gently, ever so insistent. The words he spoke to me were of one thing, and are still of one thing only: love. Love in the violence, love in the depression, love in the suicide, love to see me through. What desert are you struggling with? Are you fighting with loneliness, with anger, with doubt, with love, with hate, with injustice, with exhaustion, with hopelessness? Do you feel as if you are the last prophet, the only one left to struggle against a world that refuses to hear? Elijah assures us that we are not alone. His story is ours. God never leaves us alone. We are part of a great family that reaches through ages behind and before us. We have relationships around us to sustain us, to strengthen us, to encourage us. And when we find ourselves searching for our Mount Sinai, perhaps it's time to listen to God tell us how to take a different path. Our lives ebb and flow in and out of light and darkness, in and out of purpose and change. And God is with us always through it all. No matter how often or how much we want to break up with him, he will never break up with us.